Landlord-tenant. First thing we must really, to understand landlord and tenant law, we have to really be clear that landlord-tenant has a mixture of conveyance property and contracts. This is one area of the law where contracts has really taken a hold for what you know are obvious reasons. Tenants have become a lot more visible, more tenants, explosion of apartments. The old days of farmlands, are gone. Not gone, but they're not as prevalent as they used to be. So somehow, this area, I wish the whole property would have done this. The areas like estates and future interest, but at least in landlord-tenant, it has progressed. There's a lot of contracts and conveyancing in landlord and tenant. So when you're studying, please make sure you try to separate those two concepts and understand when still a lot of it is about conveyancing. Unfortunately, there are times when these two things clash. When property and contracts in landlord-tenant law, when they clash and we have confusion. Otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward subject. So, when we talk about landlord and tenant law, let's start by talking about the rights and duties of the parties. Let's put it together as rights and duties. When we did this in class, we didn't talk about rights and duties. We talked about cases, and we didn't put it together in rights and duties. But it all comes down to what are the rights and duties of a landlord and what are the rights and duties of a tenant. That's what it comes down to. So, what is the first right that we can speak of that a tenant has? Simple. A tenant has the right to possession. Possession. When you rent an apartment and you come to that apartment on the day that your lease begins, right? You expect that that apartment is available to you, that you have possession, that the landlord is not there, that nobody else is there, that's your possession. Remember, landlord and tenant is a possessory estate. It's like fee simple, fee tail, right? It's a present possessory estate. So you want to begin possessing it. There are two views as to the right of possession that we have discussed in class, and in fact there are cases in there, and they're known, as the English view and the American view. Let's be clear. The majority of jurisdictions still follow the American rule, but the English rule is emerging. So I would say that's the preferred view, the English view, right? What is the English view? The English view tells us that a landlord has to deliver legal as well as actual possession. Landlord is in breach of the lease if he doesn't give you legal as well as actual possession. If there is a prior tenant there, he must have evicted that tenant. He must have evicted that tenant. Now, if there's a stranger there, or if he has evicted the tenant and the tenant still remains there, still is the problem of the landlord. He has to give you legal as well as actual possession. The other view is that the landlord, as long as the landlord is not at fault, correct, he has to give you only legal possession. If he gave notice to the tenant and the tenant held over, and that's your problem now, the tenant. You have to go and evict the tenant because the landlord only has to give you legal possession. Right? That's basic. That's the first right that a tenant has, the right to possession. Makes sense. Now, what happens once you gain possession? Well, you want to be free from any interference in your enjoyment of the property by the landlord, his agents, or anyone with superior title to the property, meaning a mortgagee, whoever. That is called quiet enjoyment. Quiet enjoyment. Now let's understand this. At one point, quiet enjoyment has developed now. But quiet enjoyment meant free from physical interference. That's what it meant. Free from actual physical interference. The law has evolved now so that in some instances a interference such as an elevator not working, lack of heat, things that do not permit you to enjoy your property have been found by the courts to be a breach of the covenant of quiet enjoyment. So, under the modern law, it doesn't have to be actual physically being there. Some acts that interfere with your enjoyment of the property of your possession constitute a breach of the covenant of quiet enjoyment. Now, that's going to make a little bit more sense when we start looking at habitability, and there's a fine line in between there when one becomes the next. So let's hold on to that for a second. In turn, in the quid pro quo, I have a right to possess, correct? I have a right to quiet enjoyment. In other words, I can move in. What do I have to do? I pay rent. That's my duty. To have a place which is livable, which is free of interference, right? I pay rent. That's the quid pro quo. There was a time where the covenants were independent, right? And if you didn't pay rent, you could only be sued for the payment of rent. That's not the way it is anymore. Now we see the document as a whole document, and non-payment of rent is considered sufficient to evict you, to get you out of the lease. So that's, again, the merge of property with contracts. There are excuses, there are defenses that are available to you for the non-payment of rent. You only have to pay rent, right, if certain things occur. There are defenses that can be raised. One of them is the landlord evicts you. If the landlord goes to court and the landlord actually and physically evicts you, that stops your obligation to pay rent. Okay? Now, let's stop here for a moment because there's some little confusion. There's some confusion here with the textbook. There are jurisdictions. In general, you only owe, under the traditional common law, you only owe rent up to the moment that you're evicted. You don't owe rent after. That's the majority rule. You owe rent up to the moment you're evicted. That's, there's an emerging trend, and a lot of jurisdictions have changed that so that there are penalties, acceleration clauses, like Texas, where there might be certain fees that you have to pay. But in general, the rule is that you only owe money up to the moment of actual eviction. In other words, physical and actual eviction is an excuse for the payment of future rent, not the payment of prior rent. You still owe the rent up to that day. A re-renting, a surrendering your property is not a defense. We had the case where the tenant sent a letter with the key. Remember, the father-in-law said, I'm not getting married anymore. My father-in-law is not going to pay for the apartment. I cannot afford it. Please take over the apartment. Here are the keys. I surrender. A surrender is not an excuse for rent unless the landlord accepts it. Unless the landlord accepts the surrender. Now here's what the question of fact is. What is an acceptance by the landlord? What actions by the landlord constitute an acceptance of the surrender? Well, we know that physically moving in, the landlord, moving into the property is a message saying, I have now accepted your surrender. The landlord can re-rent the apartment under the previous tenant's care. In that case, if it's clear that the landlord is renting the apartment on behalf of the prior tenant, correct? That is not an acceptance of surrender. That is not an acceptance of surrender. If the landlord leases the property on his behalf, then it is an acceptance of the surrender. Look carefully at the words, because sometimes in the fact patterns and the Barbary questions and everything, they'll tell you that. They'll say, landlord rents the property, on behalf of the tenant. If he does that, you're still liable for the rent if it's not paid. Of course, in that case, if the rent is higher than what the tenant agreed with the landlord, guess what? The extra money goes to the tenant, not to the landlord, if he rented it on behalf of the tenant. More important than all this stuff is the defense of constructive eviction. Constructive eviction is a defense to, well, let me start again. Of course, if you were physically evicted, correct, that excuses the rent. There are times, however, where a landlord can constructively evict you, meaning you are evicted, but you're still there. You're not physically, he doesn't physically come in and grab you, or he doesn't have a court order. Things happen that result in you having to leave the apartment. Right? Now, if that's the situation, you can always, use as a defense. If you have to move out because the apartment is not livable, it's not habitable, or there's a problem with the apartment that you cannot enjoy it, correct? Then you have been constructively evicted, and that stops your duty to pay rent. Now listen to my words. Not only listen to what I said in terms of constructive eviction. Constructive means what? Not an actual eviction, but a kind of an eviction. And I said, when your enjoyment of the property, when you cannot enjoy your property. So constructive eviction, you are constructively evicted when a landlord interferes with the covenant of quiet enjoyment. That's when constructive eviction occurs. Long-term failure to provide elevator service, failure to provide heat in the winter. All these things are things that interfere with your enjoyment of the property. But it has to be, for you to be able to raise this defense, that interference has to be substantial. It has to be so bad that you are unable to enjoy the premises. That's the key. That's the key. And this is going to be important, because when we start comparing this defense to the breach of the covenant of habitability, you will remember that the main difference is that you can raise the covenant of a breach of the covenant of habitability while you still live there. Whereas with the breach of the covenant of quiet enjoyment, you must leave the premises. Another excuse or defense to payment of rent is the frustration of purpose or illegality. Under the common law, courts allowed tenants to avoid the lease if they use only if the use of the premises became illegal. That was the only, under the common law, that was the only allowance. That was the only permissible way that courts would allow the defense of a defense against payment. The use of the promised premises allowed by the lease became later illegal. If, for example, a tenant leased land for raising worms, or I knew that was going to happen. Worms. The tenant, under the common law, this is a caveat, the tenant could not avoid the lease if there was another use for the property. If he could not raise mink, correct? As long as he could use the property, you couldn't raise defense. Again, this is seen as a conveyance rather than a contract, because you were really renting the land. See what I mean? Your contract was not to sell worms. The contract was to use land to raise worms, right? So if the use of raising worms became illegal, if you could raise mink, you could not avoid the payment of rent. You couldn't avoid it. That was a traditional common law, seeing it as a conveyance. Under the modern law, when you bring in the concept of contracts, correct? If you rented the property for raising mink and that becomes illegal, you are excused from paying rent, because your purpose was, you have a contract view. It's a contract view. You're not renting the land. You're renting the land to raise mink for that specific purpose. That's the contract. The contract is to raise mink. And if you cannot raise mink anymore because it became illegal, right? Therefore, you don't have any use for the land, regardless of whether or not you can use it to raise anything else. That's the modern law, and that's what you will follow as far as frustration of purpose or illegality. Some courts, some states extend the concept of illegality to acts of God, to preventing illegality. For example, if you rented a boathouse and there was a drought, correct? And there's no water in the lake anymore, and the purpose for which you rented the boathouse was to do what? Use your boat. That's an act by God, an act of God by a third party, and that will become a supervening illegality. However, that is just some courts, some jurisdictions, some states that have incorporated that. Maybe 50 years from now it will be more popular. Maybe not. I don't think that a lot of lakes are going to dry up yet. Not in my generation. If we be driving SUVs, we may do that for the next. But not that I mind SUVs, but just environmental problems. But as of right now, that's not foreseeable. So the way it stands right now, under the traditional common law, if the purpose for which you rented the property became illegal, you could avoid paying rent as long as you couldn't use the land for another purpose. Under the common law, under the majority, under the modern law, the trend, the one that you need to know, if you rented it for a purpose and that purpose became illegal, you can now avoid payment of rent. Payment of rent. Mitigation, right? Suppose that you surrender the property. The landlord doesn't accept it. You're still liable, right? Does the landlord have a duty to mitigate damages? the majority of jurisdictions say yes. There is a duty to mitigate damages. However, be careful. Mitigation of damages doesn't have to be extraordinary. All that is expected from the landlord is that he be reasonable, that he makes a reasonable effort. If a landlord has 50 apartments, right, he doesn't have to stop renting the other 49 to rent yours for you. But on the other hand, the landlord cannot, if somebody wants to see it, the landlord cannot say, oh, no, this one is still being paid by somebody, why don't I show you something else? So the landlord has to make reasonable efforts to show the apartment, and if somebody doesn't rent it, that's okay, as long as the landlord tried. So he has a duty to mitigate. The biggest defense, and the modern one, the one that's really a fruit of modern day habitation, urban growth, is the covenant of habitability. And a breach of the covenant of habitability raises a defense to payment of rent. What is a covenant of habitability? First of all, let's understand this, that this covenant in majority of jurisdiction is only a covenant that applies to residential leases. There is an emerging use of it for commercial leases, okay? Emerging. However, that's not there yet. It's mostly used on residential leases. The covenant of habitability in the majority of jurisdiction applies to residential leases and not to commercial leases yet. Although an emerging view is that commercial leases are included. What is the covenant of habitability? Simple. The landlord makes promises to not only give you possession of an apartment for your rent. The landlord will give you the possession of the apartment. The landlord promises not to interfere. Him, his agents, or anybody with superior title would not interfere with your enjoyment of that property, and the landlord gives you a habitable apartment. Now, how do we know what a habitable apartment is? In most places, like Houston, you can find the definition of habitable in the city codes, in state regulations. That's what habitable means. And if you go to city codes, you could see habitable. A habitable apartment is one free of roaches, free of this, free of mosquitoes, with heat during the summer. It defines. So if you are practicing law in a big city and you want to see whether or not, or you're a tenant and you want to see whether or not the landlord is breaching, because you don't like what's happening, and you want to see whether the landlord is breaching the covenant of habitability, you go to the codes and you check the city codes, and the city codes will tell you what a habitable apartment is, right? Absent city codes, because not every jurisdiction has a city hall. For example, Atascocita is an unincorporated area. Up to recently, Kingwood was unincorporated, so there was no city hall. In places like that, how do you define a habitable? Well, the only way I can suggest to you is if it involves your health, safety, and welfare. Anything that it adversely affects your health, your safety, and your welfare makes the apartment inhabitable, right? I am living in an apartment where there is an infestation of rats, right? Now, it's not enough. It just bothersome. They create a problem. They disturb me, but I can still live there, right? How do I defend myself from the payment of rent? Well, obviously, I can't say the landlord is interfering with me physically, right? I cannot say that there is an event which doesn't permit me to enjoy my living in the apartment because I'm still living there. So I can't say that my covenant of quiet enjoyment was breached, right? However, you can argue that having rats in the house is unhealthy. Diseases, right? If they bite the children, they carry diseases, serious illnesses. Therefore, even though I can still live in the apartment, and it's not so bad that I have to move out, right? Because technically, even though I want to, I can still live there, uncomfortable. But but it's really affecting my health. Then your defense is the breach of the covenant of habitability. Where's the fine line here? This is the problem. Where is the fine line? Right? You have an apartment without sprinklers. Correct? Well, that's a safety problem. Correct? However, you are not in a place where there is a code. Right? So the question is, well, what is my best defense? Constructive eviction or breach of the covenant of habitability? Correct? Well, I mean, it depends on how bad it is. Right? The difference between the defense of constructive eviction and the difference between the defense of the breach of the covenant of habitability lies in the fact that for you to raise the defense of the breach of the covenant of habitability, you must not be able to enjoy the premises at all. It's so bad that you can't be there. Whereas with the covenant of habitability, you can raise it even if you still have the ability to remain in the property. That's the key. What's the danger? I don't like rats. I'm sensitive to rats. I can't live here. It's impossible for me to enjoy my property. I move out. Landlord brings an eviction action. I come in and I say, defense, I don't owe him any rent. Lease is terminated. He breached the covenant of habitability because by there being rats in the apartment, which he didn't eradicate, right? He has constructively evicted me. You moved out. It takes a year, right, for the court to hear the case. Court looks at the case and says, you know what? It is true that is a health hazard, correct? It is true that is a health hazard. However, you could have remained in the apartment. Therefore, I'm going to abate the rent, right, to what the rent should have been without rats, as opposed to rent with rats, and you owe the rest. What's happening here? What's going on? Is there something going on? Oh, for the little thing with you. It's just that. So everybody understands the difference here? Now, what that means is when you are looking at a problem or a fact pattern and it asks you which one of these two defenses is the best defense, you have to look at the facts. Number one, if it involves health, safety, and health, probably the best defense is the breach of the covenant of habitability, right? However, if that breach of your health, safety, and welfare, if the effect on your health, safety, and welfare is so bad that you are unable to remain in the apartment, correct? Now, the best defense would be constructive eviction, right? If you cannot. It seems to me that it's always better to raise habitability because you remain there, right? Whereas if you raise constructive eviction and then the court decides that you could have lived there, sometimes housing courts are very tough on what enjoying property could mean. And the court decides, hey, you could have stayed there. It's not so bad. A few rats here and there, uncomfortable, it's a problem, I don't like it, it's unhealthy, but it's not enough for you to pack your bags and leave and break your lease. So keep that in mind, because in my opinion, when you are dealing with problems that deal with the defense to payment of rent, a lot of the times you're going to be confronted with making a decision as to whether it was a breach of the covenant of habitability or the breach of the covenant of quiet enjoyment. Remember, too, that I started by telling you that it has developed. The law has developed. At one point, a constructive eviction meant the landlord physically evicting you. So if the problem was there was no heat, correct, on the old days, that was the landlord. The landlord has not constructively evicted you, right? Because he hasn't physically interfered with you, right? However, the modern trend has been to say, yes, he has, by not providing you with heat. Tell me, folks, if I'm your landlord and I turn off your water, haven't I, in effect, evicted you? And that's how the courts see it under the modern time. He may not have physically gone in there and taken you out or put a lock in your door, but indirectly, by cutting off your water, your heat, correct? By putting in a couple of rats in there and killing all the cats in the neighborhood, the landlord has constructively evicted you. Yes?
Don't you have to, I don't know, but do you have to tell the landlord before, like, give them opportunity to fix the problem?
Yes, you always do that, but if it's constructive eviction,
you don't have to.
You don't, because it's so bad. It's got to be. That's the key. You got to look at how bad how bad it is. Yeah. Yes, of course. You always, and in fact, you can't do that by paying rent, abating your rent. That's notice. Unless you fix the heat, unless you fumigate, I abate my rent. I'm not giving you $300 a month. I'm only giving you $100. The problem is that you have to be very careful with that, because in a lot of states, it is illegal to withhold rent. It's actually illegal to withhold the rent. So what was done in those jurisdictions is the tenant stops paying the rent, but puts it in an escrow account on behalf of the landlord. Puts it in an escrow account so that when the court sees the case, the money's there. So you got to be careful about when you withhold rent and when you don't. But yes, you should give the landlord reasonable notice, like everything else. What is the duty of the landlord if you don't pay rent? Again, he can bring an action in debt. He can not only can the landlord seek to. There's two different things. Evict you, but he can always bring an action in debt for whatever you owe him up to that point. Two different things. We tend to think that one thing goes with the other, right? Two different things. One is the physical, leave my property. The other one is, you leave my property, but you owe me rent up to that point. So he can evict you, and he can also seek debt action. In some instances, you have acceleration clauses. Be careful, because just like in contracts, if the acceleration clause is more is punishing, the court will find them to be not acceptable. If you leave the apartment, you have to pay me $1 million, and the rent would have been $200. That's not recovering debt. That is punishment. And usually acceleration clauses is a way of avoiding having to go to court and seeking damages. So be careful with those acceleration clauses. So the landlord can start an action in debt for rent due. The landlord can also evict you for failure to pay rent. So far, so good. So right now we have here duties and responsibility in general. I didn't speak anything about building burning down. I didn't speak anything about eminent domain. We think those things we have reviewed. Pay attention to them. They're not big, but they do exist. What if the city decides to take over the property? If in the agreement In the agreement, it said that in the case of eminent domain, total possession by the government, both parties can negotiate with the government. Both parties can. Otherwise, the landlord negotiates for you and for them for your interest in the land. One more question.
For frustration of purpose and legality under the modern law, you still, if the purpose for which you rent is destroyed, and there's other purpose, you still
abate. You still, not abate. You still exempted from paying rent.
Okay, so is it then the same?
I rent your property to raise mink. City council passed an ordinance saying raising mink is illegal. I have an excuse to pay rent, even though I could use it to raise cows. It doesn't matter. That's the modern law. See it as a contract. What did you, when you rented land from me to raise mink, what was the contract for? The use of the land or land to raise mink? Land to raise mink. On the old common law, right, you didn't raise the land to raise mink. You rented the land. Now, you decided to use that land to raise mink, but you were not paying for the use of the land, you were paying for the land. Therefore, right, if it became illegal to raise mink, you still had to pay me rent, as long as the land could be used for something else, right? If you could then raise cows, you still had the land. In fact, in the old days, if you rented land with a building, and the building burned down, you still had to pay rent. Why? Because you didn't rent the building, you rented the land, right? That's the conveyance concept. On the modern law, it's not, you didn't rent land, you rented a building, which happens to be in land. What good is it for me to have the land if I rented a building so I can sell cars, right? And now the building burns down, I got land, but can I sell cars? No. So that's the modern law. That's the modern law. Okay. What is the landlord's responsibilities as far as the premises are concerned? Here we talked about caveat emptor. Not a lot. In general, landlord is not responsible for anything except the common areas. And we speak of common areas when we have multiple dwellings, right? That's the only time you have common areas. You don't have common areas if the landlord is renting you a house. What's the common area? There's nothing in common. But if you're renting you multiple dwellings meaning up to 2, that's multiple, right? The landlord is responsible for the maintenance of the common areas. He has no duty to repair anything else. No duty to repair, except the common areas. However, if the landlord decides, right, that he's going to come in and do something he's not supposed to do, repair your chimney, right? Now he's liable. Now he's liable for undertaking to do something that he wasn't to repair. I know that last night some of you were thinking about torch, and you were having the dream, and I know it came in a lot of you after yesterday, where you're sitting on the bay, you know, on the dock, and you look down and you see me drowning, you know, and you go, "Oh, that's Colon drowning." Do I have to go and jump over to? No, I don't have to. And you're not liable, right? And you say, you know what? If I jump in and I try to go get him, once I start swimming, right, I'm in trouble. So I'm not going to swim, because once I start going, I have undertaken. This is torch, right? It's the same. And I know a lot of you had that dream last night. I mean, I know because I have connections. But it's the same concept in terms of landlord-tenant. The landlord, just like the person sitting on the dock, can sit there, right, and see the repairs that need to be done in your apartment, and he can say, well, that's not my problem. You have to repair the apartment, the things in the apartment, right? However, once the landlord decides to go and repair it, it's the same thing that the person that jumps in the water. He undertook to repair it. You had the exercise, which seemed to be trivial, of writing leases, right? and we had a little fun with it. You wrote a lease. In that lease, you can change that. The landlord can say, I know I have no duty to repair, therefore I only will be held responsible for the common areas. Tenant says, but wait a second, I want you to replace the carpeting once a year. I want you to repair the ceiling falls. I want you to repair the ceiling. All those things. You can, on the lease, undertake to do that. But in general, landlord, the landlord made no implied, let me put it in legal terms. Landlord made no implied warranty that the premises were or will remain in a particular state. They didn't make any promises. That wasn't one of the duties of the landlord. Therefore, he wasn't liable for any defects that occurred, unless it was in the common area. He did have to tell you, the landlord has a duty to tell you about latent defects if he knows about them. But that's all he has to do. He has a duty not to repair them, but a duty to disclose it to you. A duty to disclose that latent defect. If he fails to disclose it, not repair it, if the landlord fails to disclose that, then he's liable for any damages that may arise out of that latent defect. Remember the case of the flooding of the basement, where the court said that was a latent defect, even though they knew about it the second time they came around the lease. Remember? Because there was no way that the tenant, by looking outside the house, could have ever known that that basement was going to flood when it rained. That was latent. Speak of, and I want to still tell you so that you don't think that I don't know about it. We didn't speak of short-term leases. We didn't speak of short-term public use because those things don't usually come up in general. But landlord in short-term leases, furnished apartments, the landlord has a duty on short-term leases. They have a duty to repair. It's a difference between long-term leases and short-term leases, meaning of 1 week, 2 days, type of thing. So when you rent an apartment, a hotel room for 3 weeks, that means you're full of energy. No, usually just takes 55 minutes. If you're out of town and you're visiting in business and you rent an apartment that is furnished for 3 weeks only, correct? And it's furnished. In that case, the landlord has a duty to repair the premise. But we didn't spend a lot of time talking about that. All right. So let's talk in general about what we have. Let's just kind of recap everything, because then we're going to get pretty close to the last thing, which is assignment and sublease. Here's how we see it. Landlord has a duty to give you possession. Landlord is the duty to give you possession of a habitable apartment. Landlord has a duty to not interfere with your enjoyment of the property. Right? Landlord has a duty to repair only the common areas. Landlord has a duty to let you know of latent defects. Outside of that, there's not a lot more. And landlord has a duty to provide you with anything that he agreed with in the lease, right? That's the landlord's duties in a nutshell. Right? Remember, you cannot agree to anything that is a violation of public policy. You cannot agree to anything that's illegal. In fact, if you entered into an agreement as to an apartment that was already in violation of the city ordinances or city health codes, if you did that, the lease is illegal and you don't owe a penny, not even back payments. Not even back payments. So one thing you can think about is, You move into an apartment, and 3 months later, right, you find out that it's a code violation, right? That the heat is not working, and the city defines habitable as having heat, correct? You move out, or you sue the landlord, right? If you find out that that violation was there before you enter into a lease, right? Not only can you be excused from paying the rent for those 3 months you were there, but you are able to rescind the lease, terminate the lease, and not pay anything because it was an illegal lease in the first place, right? So that's the concept of the illegal lease. That's the landlord's duty, correct? In terms for all those nice things, that's what you get for $1,200 a month, or whatever you pay a month. That's what you get. In terms for that, what do? You pay rent. You pay rent, and you promise not to commit waste, and you promise to maintain the premises in good repair. It's up to you, not the landlord, to maintain the premises in good repair. There will be wear and tear, but that's okay. That's not your problem. As long as you maintain it in good repair and turn it over as good as you can, considering the wear and tear, as you got it in the first place, then you're okay. Here comes a little concept called fixtures. Fixtures. A fixture is when a personal item is attached to the realty, so that tearing it out from the realty will cause damages. Right? If you take a painting and you put it on the wall to the extent that it's attached to the wall, so removing that painting would cause damage to the wall, that painting now becomes a fixture. The tenant is liable for damages caused by the removal of fixtures, unless the tenant can show that that fixture was a necessity to their business. For example, a dentist chair, right? That's part of the dentist business. So when the dentist comes in and puts those chairs there permanently, it becomes a fixture. And when he or she moves out, tears out the dentist chairs, takes them with them, they leave damages behind, they're not liable for that. Why? Even though it was a fixture, correct? The fact is that it was part of his business. Part of his business, the fixture. Now, is that fair? Well, it is, because when a landlord rents to a dentist, the landlord knows that a dentist, as part of his trade or her trade, is going to bring in things that are going to attach to the property. And removal of those things are going to cause damages. So what do? They charge whatever the damage is going to be on the rent up front. So that's why when it's a business, it's fair for the tenant to remove it. Outside of that, any damage that's caused by the removal of any personal property, which attaches to it, which becomes a fixture, now the tenant is liable for it. Are you liable for the nail holes in the wall? Well, no, of course not. And you can see usually in the lease where it says tenant is allowed to hang up paintings or whatever. See, are you liable if you put a hole in there to put an air conditioner and then you leave and you leave the hole behind? Yes, you are, because once you put a hole in the wall to put that air conditioning in there, what have you done? You have now created a fixture. Let's talk a little bit about waste. Tenant obligation not to commit waste. And I want to go back to estates and future interest, because on the estates and future interest, we spoke about waste. Now let me go back and see if I can find it for a moment.